Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Kavinsky's Tutorials. Today is a sponsored episode, and I'm looking at the new visual synth from Imaginando, so usually just called VS. I've been playing around with this for a couple of weeks. Really, really cool app. A lot of people have been looking for something like this. I think it's going to be very well received in the community. Now, here I'm looking at it on iOS, but this is a simultaneous release for desktop and iOS, and pretty much identical. There's one current difference between the desktop version and the iOS version that I'll talk about later, but probably soon that difference will disappear. So for all intents and purposes, iOS version and desktop version is the same. Now, before I get started, let me mention that Imaginando have also given me a very generous giveaway for this video. So 5 subscribers to the channel have the chance to win any Imaginando app. So you're not limited to choosing VS. You can get any Imaginando app for iOS or for desktop. Now, all the instructions of what you've got to do to win, as usual, are in the pinned comment at the top of the YouTube comments section. If you're watching this video after the first 2 days of release and you've missed the chance to win, well, consider subscribing to the channel anyway, because I almost always have great giveaways and do detailed walkthroughs on videos. So, first example I'm going to let you hear here, I just want to make it clear that this is something that you don't need to use on techno or whatever, because in a minute I'm going to let you hear it on more beats-based music. If you're a fan of my channel, you'll know that I generally do stuff that's a bit more ambient, experimental, and so on. So I just want to, right off the bat, make it clear that we can use this for ambient stuff, we can use it for experimental stuff, we can use it for beatless stuff. So I have here a little example patch that I made where in VS we're using audio modulation. If we look down at the bottom right here, now I'm going to walk you through the whole interface, so I'm just kind of jumping ahead a little bit here to show you one of the cool things that it can do. If you look down here at this section, this threshold button, watch how this image changes as I adjust the threshold amount. And what this is doing is adjusting the way that the bass frequencies in this drone are modulating the images here. So for example, when I bring this down low, we're getting very little modulation. Bring it up here, we're getting a lot of modulation. So, what is special or what is interesting about VS? Well, basically, Imaginando made this as a kind of visualization tool, the kind of thing that VJs and people like that would use, but designed for people who come more from a musical background. So people who are more familiar with synth terminology than the kind of terminology that would usually be used in visualization programs. So that means that they're using terms like modulation, waveforms, LFOs, envelopes, and things like that. Particularly if you already use Imaginando's apps, this interface is going to be pretty easy for you to get to grips with. Okay, so in today's video, what I'm going to do is give you a detailed walkthrough of the whole interface. If you watch this video, you pretty much won't need to read the manual. Now, also want to mention, even though this is a sponsored video, it's still a Kavinsky video. And if you're a regular of my channel, you'll know that I almost always have suggestions for improvements and so on in apps. And you'll still get that in this video, even though it's sponsored. I'll scatter throughout the video suggestions for improvements, as well as at the end when I give my final kind of summary covering the pros and cons of the app. As I mentioned, I'll also go into some current differences between the desktop and the iOS version. So let's first get started with a little sample of what this can do. Now, if we look up at the top of the screen, we can see here that we have this thing called demo, and we can enable different demos in different genres, and then we can use those to get an idea of what the different patches do. Now, what is the point of using the demos? The point is that to really see the images that VS can create doing interesting things, generally you're going to be wanting to use some kind of audio modulation or MIDI input and so on and so on. So the demo tracks actually have internal routing of MIDI, which will modulate the presets in various ways. So the first time you pick up the app, if you just have a session and you just load VS at the end, and if, for example, you don't pipe some MIDI in here, or you don't play around with the modulation and so on in the right way for the stuff that you're putting in, you might not get that interesting a result. So the best thing to do first when you're playing with it, get a sense of what it can do, is enable one of the demos. Let's choose Techno 2, for example. And let's just open up and I'll just go through the factory patches. Now, let's make these full screen. How do we do that? See this little square down here? Just tap that. Now, obviously, in a host like AUM or in any AOS host, there is no actual ability to make any audio unit completely full screen. But Imaginando are going to talk to Jonathan, the developer of AUM, and see if maybe he could bring in that ability to get an audio unit to open absolutely full screen within AUM itself. Another cool thing I want to mention, and this was actually a suggestion of mine, when we're in full screen mode, we can swipe down, right? So just do downward swipe or an upward swipe to move back and forth between the presets. This is really cool because it means we can sample the presets while staying in full screen mode. I like this one. A lot of these presets were designed by Perplexon. All of them, actually. Let's double tap to go out of that and change our demo. Let's change to mellow techno. Some of these patches are going to sound better with certain demos than others because of the way the MIDI is routed in them. So if a couple of them seem boring, when you actually tweak them yourself in the right way to suit the music that you're putting in, they're going to look cool. Try some drum and bass. by the way, everyone, note that there are timestamps in this video, so you can skip around to the sections that you're most interested in. Okay. So let's go and walk through, get a quick overview of the main interface, and then I'll actually go through every part of the interface in detail. So the first thing I'll do is give you a walk through the interface, a very quick overview of how things are laid out. So up on the top left here, we can open up some different things related to settings. For example, here in settings, we can set our frame rate. We can reduce or increase our quality. We can reduce the number of voices and so on. Let's just click out of that. I don't like to spend too much time on these things. These things are very easy to grasp, and you can check them in the manual yourself. Now here we turn MIDI learn on and off. So notice if I turn MIDI learn on, you can see that all these knobs down here have suddenly faded out. So let's say I want to assign this brightness to a knob on my external MIDI controller. Then as long as I've got my MIDI controller connected to this, when I select this, if I twiggle a little knob on my MIDI controller, it will automatically be assigned to this. So there's MIDI learn there. So I'm glad it has MIDI learn. A lot of apps, particularly on iOS, do not have MIDI learn, and we need to use our host's internal systems for assigning MIDI, and sometimes it's not as convenient as having MIDI learn. So it's good that it has that. Now, our BPM is being controlled by the host, so clock source is not relevant here. We've already seen what this demo part can do. Now here, when we click here, we can select our presets. We can also save presets. We can do things like add tags to presets. Now presets, your own presets by default will be saved in the local bank, and the factory presets will be kept in the factory bank. We have here a reset button. So let's say, for example, you load up a preset, you make some changes and you decide, I don't really like this. I want to go back to the way this preset was at the beginning. Then you simply use this to revert to the way the preset was before you started fiddling with it. We have here our preset backwards and forwards buttons. Now, one thing I want to point out here, local. If you click on local, you can see this little arrow here, and that's an export button. So we can basically export all our local presets and share them with other people. And we can easily import presets as well. Okay, now let's click out of that. You can see, by the way, also we can filter presets by using the tag system. So if I click drum and bass, it'll only show me presets that have the tag drum and bass. Now then, here we have a little help thing, which is currently showing us what this color panel does and so on. Then we go through next, it'll guide us through the app, but there is also a good online manual. So anyway, you can use this to get a quick overview right in the app of what different things do. I want to mention that this is one of the differences between the iOS version and the desktop version. So currently the desktop version has this thing called pop out. Pop out the display area to a new window, useful to take the display area to another display or projector. This would mean that, for example, you could use it for live VJing. You could control and modify things in this, but you could project just the rendering to another screen, another device, or whatever. The iOS version currently does not have this, but Imaginando are working on it and say it is highly likely that that is going to be added to the iOS version. But I think it's very important to mention that currently this is, well, as the app comes out, this is only available on desktop. Okay, let me get rid of this. I just click that question mark to get rid of it again. Now down here, we have backwards, well, undo and redo buttons. I'm really glad this was my suggestion that these got added, and I'm glad that was implemented. It's one thing I want to mention about Imaginando. They're very, very receptive to user suggestions. If you are a user of LK, for example, and you're also a user of the Audiobus forum, you will know that the thread about LK in the Audiobus forum is absolutely massive, because Nuno from Imaginando is extremely active in that thread, listening to people's ideas. So, if there are things that you would like to see in this app, contact Imaginando and suggest, I think it would be really cool if this did blah, blah, blah. Now, obviously, they're not going to necessarily implement every user suggestion, but I would say among developers I know, Imaginando are one of the most responsive, and they also care a lot about bug fixes. They regularly fix bugs in their apps. They regularly make changes, regularly make improvements. They're not the kind of developer who brings something out, just dumps it on the market and leaves it. Not at all. Okay, so that's very important to mention. So we have here then in the middle our rendering area, and then down here we have this thing called the layers panel or something like that. And we see here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So we can have up to 8 layers. And we also have, or we can have, a background layer, which we can see here. And that layer can be an image or it can be video. I'll mention now, but I'll probably come back into this later. These different 8 what are called material layers can all be modulated by the modulation matrix within the app, but the background layer, due to some technical limitations, cannot. However, later in the video, I'm going to show how you can modulate the background layer, for example, rotate it, make it bigger, or do other things by using an external LFO, for example, or you could use other things, but I'm going to show you using an external LFO. So it's a pity that it has this technical limitation, but there are workarounds. As I say, you can use external LFOs and so on. And Imaginando are going to look into some ways that maybe video and so on could be loaded into the actual materials layers themselves, and that would help to be a workaround for this architectural limitation that is not currently allowing internal modulation of the background layer. Now, I'm going to look at this layers panel later in more detail. This is just a quick overview of the main interface. So here, we click this once and we'll get this window opening up. Now, here, by the way, these things are related to the layers here, and we'll talk about those more when we come back to the layers panel later. But down here, this is what gets opened up when we pop this. You see this layer is always there. But when we click this, here we get our LFO section opened up, and we have 4 different LFOs that can be sent to modulate various things. We have a choice of different waveforms, rate, and so on and so on. Here we have 2 different envelopes that we can also use for modulation, and we can apply different amounts of attack and release to each of those. What that will act as is basically fade in and fade out. And then over here we have one of my favorite sections, the audio modulation section, and I'm really looking forward to showing you how cool that is in more detail later in the video. Now then, if we click again on this modulation thing, we'll get the mod matrix opening. Now, Imaginando have tried to use the interface space as efficiently as possible. So what they've done is, instead of having a separate screen for a mod matrix, they've divided it into 3 sections that we can kind of scroll through. So we can see here, we've got this highlighted yellow bar, and then here, this is kind of grayed out. So we can see that at the moment, we're getting access to the modulation for hue, saturation, brightness, and alpha. Now, all of these are just for layer 2. If we clicked into layer 1, layer 3, whatever, would be getting different things. But then if I click here, now we're getting the next layer of the modulation section: speed, glow, elements, offset. Click here, then we come to the third section: spread, rotation. So that's this modulation section. So that's a quick overview of the whole of the interface. Now let's go through and look at this layers panel in more detail. Okay, so here I have loaded a Perplexon patch called Reactor. Now if we look down here, we can see that there are 2 layers enabled in this preset. So for example, here I've got layer 1 selected, so all of these controls are now referring to layer 1. I can solo layer 1. I can solo layer 2, but watch what's going to happen here. It's actually going to turn black. Now I'm going to explain. This is something that can be extremely confusing when you go in and start tweaking the presets, because whether you actually see a layer or not, or exactly what way a layer is behaving, will depend a lot on what's set up here. So this is the colors palette, let's say, for this layer, but also very important, the blend mode. So what are these blend modes? Well, if we go to Imaginando's website and look up VS, we can find the manual, and we can go to this color panel part. Here you can read the technical details about what exactly these different blend types do. For example, normal. The default mode is normal, where pixels are drawn on top of each other, effectively covering up the pixels of any layer below. So this is just like, for example, if you imagine you using a traditional canvas and painting on it, and you paint something and then you don't like it and you just paint over it, and the paint you use is thick enough and opaque enough that the layer below is obscured, right? Or then we look at the next one. Screen looks at each channel's color information and multiplies the inverse of the blend and base colors, blah, blah, blah. This effect is similar to projecting multiple photographic slides on top of each other. So that would sound like something where if we have that, we'll be able to see all the layers. So let's see. Let's just go through. Let's go through this and see what's going to actually enable us to see this layer too. So here you see, for example, now in screen we can see it, and that's what it's looking like. Hard light, we can't actually see it. Soft light. I'm going to unsolo this. So now we're seeing both layers, but I'm playing with the blend mode of layer 2. So it's very important to play with the blend type of all of the layers that you're working with, so that you really get what you're looking for. Let's just leave it on this for a second. Now we can slide along here to adjust the brightness of the layer. Now I want to show you something else that's very important as well. It's one of those things that you really want to pay attention to when you go in and start tweaking presets. if things are not behaving the way you're expecting. These are the kind of things that can really trip you up and that did my head in a little bit when I was first trying to figure out this app. So I'm trying to save you the frustration that I went through at certain points trying to figure a few things out. So when we open different presets, if we look down here at trigger, some will have MIDI and some will say none. So you can see that when none is pressed, this is doing stuff anyway. But when trigger is turned on, it's going to need MIDI input to activate the brightness. Now, how do you put MIDI into it? Well, let's look at our setup here. So VS loads as an FX module in our audio channel here in AUM. So here I've got my keyboard, right? It's putting out the sound, and I'm loading VS after that as an FX. And you can see here it has this little hamburger menu, and this is where we can pipe MIDI into it. So what I'm doing is I'm playing Fugue Machine, so I'm generating MIDI from Fugue Machine. And I've actually set up Fugue Machine in such a way that the 4 different playheads are sending different MIDI. So playhead 1 is sending MIDI on channel 1, playhead 2 is sending MIDI on channel 2, playhead 3 is sending MIDI on channel 3, etc., etc. By default, Fugue Machine would be sending all of these playheads on MIDI channel 1, but I wanted to play around with it a little bit, so I set it up in this way. So, like, this piano is actually being played by, I think, all 4 playheads, but I decided to only send in the MIDI from 2 of the playheads into VS. Now, what I did then was I went in, and if we look here, we're on layer 2. I've set MIDI trigger, and here I have chosen channel 3. So layer 2 is going to get triggered by MIDI input from channel 3. If we look at layer 1, again, I have set trigger on. If I turn it off, then it's going to be active even without MIDI input. So even when I'm not playing, I'm not doing anything, it's still going to be active. I turn this on, it's going to be inactive. Now channel here, I have set this to receive MIDI from channel 2. So this can be a cool thing to do. You might want to send in MIDI from different channels into different layers to just get more interesting interplay of the layers, get them triggered at slightly different times and come up with more interesting stuff. Again, play around with the colors and so on. Now, by default, when we are using MIDI as a trigger, if we look at the modulation matrix, that will by default be set to trigger brightness. And we'll look in more detail at the matrix later, but I just wanted to mention that. Okay, so now I'm going to solo a layer again. So I'm going to solo layer 1. So here we have layer 1. Now first thing I can do, I can enable or disable the layer. Now then we can play with alpha. Now alpha will not be noticeable on this, but I'm going to show you how alpha works later. Basically, alpha will kind of do something like affect the transparency of the black, the non-colored parts of the material. I'll show you that later. Brightness. So you can see brightness really makes a big difference. And that's why it's really, really fun to modulate brightness. And of course, MIDI is only one of the ways that we could modulate brightness. Lots of different ways, and I'm going to show you some things like that when we look at the mod matrix later. Speed. Excuse me. Now again, these are all things that we could modulate. like I say, only a few of the things are explained in the manual. Some of these different parameters you're just going to have to play around with. Some of them will be very obvious what they do, some other ones it'll be less obvious what they're doing. X you can see, and it's pretty easy to guess. That's just moving it along the x-axis. Y is doing the same on the y-axis. I think you can see pretty clearly what spacing is doing. Below. We can also have monophonic or polyphonic. I'll show you that later in a patch where it's more noticeable. Glide can work like a kind of portamento, so it can kind of cause smooth transitions between things. So there are tons of different materials, and I'm not going to go through and look at every different material and look at all the different parameters of that. That's something that'll allow you to explore on your own, but you'll see me using different presets and different materials later in the video, and things will become clear. Now, I want to mention something very important when we're here about the background layer. So background, okay, we can long press. We can also double click. So double clicking will just automatically open up the the iOS native file browser. But if I long press, I'll get an option to open files or photos. So you can go direct into your photos. This was good because it didn't have this before. Before you could only go into files, and photos were not available as a destination in files. So really useful that this got added. Or again, reset. So reset would just be if we've loaded up a video here, we can get rid of it. So when we open up files, I've got the folder videos by Perplex on here. Now this is something that Imaginando sent to me. As I mentioned earlier, I think these are not yet accessible to people on the iOS version on release. They are accessible to people on the desktop version, but they're going to be added to the iOS version. And so what there'll be then is when you click on background and you want to load something, it'll give you a choice between the internal file browser, which will offer you these videos made by Perplexon, and the native iOS file browser. So let's just click on the first one here, and we can see it's opened up. Now, I want to mention another one of these pitfalls. I think there are a few little things in this app that can really trip you up as you go along. So one thing, sometimes when you open up a background, you don't see anything, it's completely dark. And that may be because for whatever reason it happens in that patch that you did that the alpha for the background layer was turned down completely. So if you're not seeing anything when you load a background, like if you can see here, for example, that a background is loaded, and you can see here that the background is enabled, and for example here I've got this background soloed, if you're still seeing black, try and mess around with the alpha. Okay, so mentioned also earlier in the video, background layer currently cannot be modulated by the internal modulation matrix, and that is why this is faded out. So what I want to show you in the next part of the video is how to modulate the background layer. If we can't do it within the app itself, then how do we do that? Let's take a look at that next. Okay, so let's get stuck into this how to modulate the background layer. And everybody, by the way, if you're enjoying this, please do give it a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Now, as you can see here, then what we've got here is a background video. And we know it's a video because it's moving, right? It's not just an image. But when I say moving, I don't mean the rotation. I mean the actual image itself. So this is a short video. Now, if we look down here at these knobs, down at the bottom of the screen. Let me get my mouse active again. Okay, so the scale and rotate knobs, you can see they're moving around. So basically scale is changing the size. And you can see when that's near the bottom, it's when it's smaller. And as it gets up, that's when it's getting larger. And rotate is basically moving it around in a clockwise, at the moment, circle. Could be anti-clockwise too, depends how we set it up. So how is this happening? And what does it sound like as well? Now, let's say you feel that this background layer is too faded looking, then you could play with the alpha. So here's higher alpha value. I think it's better like that. Okay, so let's look at the way we've got it set up here. So in AUM, this is how we do this. So I'll close this window first. So what I'm using to modulate this is an app I really love called MIDI LFOs by Art Kearns. I've reviewed other apps of his. For example, recently I reviewed MIDI Dreams and MIDI Drums. Really does great stuff with MIDI. This is a fantastic LFO. It's got so many good features. But anyway, this video is not on that. I'll just say I strongly recommend this. So I'm using 2 LFOs from this, and I'm sending them into VS. Now, how do I do that? So let's open VS, and in AUM, I click on this little thing here. And here in this section at the top, MIDI controls, I have to choose MIDI LFOs as my MIDI controller. Now, also in AUM, I can very quickly press assigned here, and that will show me exactly where modulation is assigned. Now, one nice thing, by the way, I'll say about Imaginando, let me just click back to all. When I first started using this app, like many apps, this parameters list was just hundreds and hundreds of things, absolutely impossible to find what you wanted. What I suggested to them is what I suggest to all developers. Please, if you have an app that has a lot of parameters, organize it into submenus like this. I'm really glad to say that Imaginando, being the great responsive developer that they are, took me took that suggestion from me, and here we are. We have lovely bedded selection of parameters here. So anyway, let's click on assigned and go into background, and we can see here background scale that's being controlled on channel 1 CC46. That's because that's what I have set MIDI LFO's first LFO to send MIDI out on, and then background rotate is going out on channel 1 CC47. So if we make this a little bit smaller and look at MIDI LFOs, we could play around with the rate here, for example. So now you can see this scale is happening a lot faster. Or we could go into LFO2. I think that's the one that we assigned for rotate. And now our rotate is happening faster. And of course, we could play around with all different kinds of waveforms, etc. here, but this is not a tutorial on LFOs. So that, in a nutshell, is how we can go in. And if we look at VS again, and if we just go down to background, we can see the different things that you can modulate. So you can modulate the alpha, right? So this is sort of brightness and dimming kind of thing that we're getting. Scale, rotate, X and Y, so that'll move it around on the X and Y axis. Color hue and blah, blah, blah. You get to modulate quite a few things. Now, I will say it's definitely a pity that you can't do this within the app itself, because obviously it would be nice to actually save that background modulation in the presets itself. Instead, because you have to use this workaround, you've got to then save it in a host preset session instead. So I really do hope that Imaginando do find a workaround for that. Okay, let's move on and look at something else. Okay, so now we're going to look at the LFO section, audio modulation, the matrix, coming into the last final stretches of the video here. So one thing you can notice is we've got this little arrow button here, and we can use that to open up the mod matrix. Remember also that pressing here, this will switch between the view that shows us the LFO, the envelopes, and the audio modulation, and the matrix. And remember also that the matrix has this 3 parts that we can click through by clicking on this line here. Now, first, let's have a little listen to what's going on here. I'll also point out, why does Drum Computer have this around it? Okay, the reason is very simple, because I've got VS loaded here on the same channel as Drum Computer, but I'm routing Drum Computer's MIDI into VS. So AUM kind of thinks that that's a feedback loop, and when that happens, it puts these little dotted lines around something. It doesn't stop you doing anything, it's just telling you, okay, be careful, there may be potentially feedback loop here. But there's no kind of a dangerous audio feedback going on here. We're just feeding back the MIDI. Okay. So this is pretty cool. We've got a nice rhythmic pattern here. I mean, you could definitely imagine yourself getting down to this in a club or whatever, visuals on the wall. So double tap to get out of that full screen. And let me turn the music off for a second, and let's take a look at what is going on. So first of all, let's see. Layer 1 is being triggered by MIDI. And let's solo that. That's not actually appearing at the moment. It must be something about the... Oh, well, of course, it's because it's not getting any MIDI, right? So again, this is one of these little pitfalls with the app, yeah. These things can really trip you up. So now we're seeing layer 1 soloed. So let's pay attention to a couple of things. One thing, it's being triggered by MIDI. It's receiving MIDI on channel 1. Let's take a look at the modulation matrix and see what's going on. So in the modulation matrix, if something is at 0, it's just not being modulated. If we drag it over this direction, then that's a positive modulation. So here we're increasing the amount that alpha is getting modulated by LFO1. So we can do that positive or negative. In some things that'll be more noticeable than in others. So LFO2 is also modulating alpha. We have envelope generator 1 modulating brightness. This is default, but you can adjust the amount. We have audio modulation 1 adjusting alpha. And then in these screens we've got nothing going on. Now let's just turn off that solo. Okay, let's go into layer 2. Let's just solo layer 2. Let's take a look at the matrix. So brightness is being modulated by LFO1. Also by envelope generator 1. So remember, by default, that is connected to the MIDI. So it will respond to the MIDI. Let's go through and see if anything else is being modulated. No. Okay. So we click back on this and we'll get back to the LFOs part, and let's take a look at the LFOs and talk about those. So here we've got LFO1. We can see that we've set it up as a square. We've got it on sync, quarter notes. Here we play with the rate. And you can see we've got dotted and triplet values as well, which is great. And phase freeze, so will the LFO reset every time it gets a MIDI trigger, or will it run in free phase? So we've got 4 different LFOs that we can assign in the mod matrix. We can set them up in different ways. Now I think if you remember, we were only using LFO1 and 2 here. Let's just take a look at the different waveform types we get. Square, we get saw, triangle, sample and hold, and filtered sample and hold, which will basically, well, you can see what it'll do. It'll make smooth transitions between jumps in the reading of the data. Sine. If we turn off sync and bring the rate down, you'll see clearer that's a sine wave. And then we're back on our square. Now I want to reset this to the way it was. So remember, what we can do there is click on this little reset thing up there. So what I'll do is just do a couple of things. So one thing, let's look at the envelope generators, the attack and release. These will basically work as a fade in and fade out. So you'll see, for example, that this is allowing the brightness to linger more. We've got a less kind of flashy type effect. If we take the attack and release down, we're getting much more abrupt transitions. So just think of the attack and release as a kind of fade in and fade out. Now I want to look at the audio modulation section as well, but I want to pop over to another instance to do that. Let's do that now. Actually, first, just before we do that, let's go into this again and let's just look at the mod matrix and let's just take away all the modulation. So I'm just double tapping on these to clear the modulation. So that's layer 1 modulation's gone. So you can see that with no modulation, this background pattern is kind of lingering around a lot longer. Let's revert again to the save preset the way it should look. Let me also turn off my audio modulation actually. So let's revert. And you can see the difference there. The checkered pattern is fading out for much longer periods of time. Sometimes when it comes in, it's much less bright. In general, it's just a less dynamic patch. Okay, so let's move on. So if we look at audio modulation, which again is down here on the bottom right, again we can see that we have 4 different audio modulators that we can use. So we could assign these to different things, we could assign them to different layers and so on. Now, I'm going to concentrate on layer 3 here. I'm just going to solo this, and this is what we're seeing as layer 3 here. And if we look down here, we can see we have 2 modes for audio modulation. One is called spectrum and one is called gate. We can also see that we have this threshold thing, and we can see that we have attack, release, and gain. Now we can also see that at the moment there's no audio there, so I'm going to bring in some audio. And so now we're seeing this represented. Here we'll have bass frequencies going all the way up to high frequencies because we're in spectrum mode. Here's just gate mode. Now threshold. Let me explain this first. So when the audio crosses over the threshold line, the modulation will be triggered. Of course, that will all depend on whether we have assigned modulation to something in the matrix here. So you can see that at the moment, I've assigned modulation to density and clouds, and maybe in a minute I'll go in and assign it to some other things. But that's what it's assigned to at the moment. Now, attack and release, again, you can understand if we put a slow attack, when the audio passes over the threshold line, it will be slower to induce the modulation. If we have a high release value, even when the audio passes under the threshold, it will take a while for the effect to disappear. Okay, and then we have a gain thing here we can use to turn up if we're getting very low signal and we want to boost it so that we maybe get something more noticeable to work with, make it a bit easier to dial in our threshold exactly, then we can use the gain. So let's just get our audio going again here. This was just a little drone loop that I recorded using one of the Swam violas into Gauss. And so let's look at gate first. So if I pull the threshold down, you'll see now we're starting to get some of these brightening effects and so on. But we're going to notice this a lot more when we go into the spectrum mode. So let's go to spectrum. Now, look where the threshold line is, and this is the part of the spectrum that we have selected to trigger the effect. All this part of the spectrum is under the threshold line, so we're not going to get anything. At that point, we have a couple of choices. Either we can increase gain, but in this case, we've already increased gain to the maximum, so that's not going to work. Instead, what we're going to do here is just move this over. And you can see now already we're starting to get some modulation effect because some of this is crossing over the threshold line. If we bring it over here, we're going to get something much more noticeable. And then we could play with the threshold. So you can see if we bring the threshold right down, we're getting this, pure descent into whiteness. So, this is something really cool to play with. So if we bring it down here, now it's going to be triggered by more bass frequencies. So again, we bring the threshold up. This is not touching it, so it's not going to cause any modulation. Bring it down here, now we're going to start to get a little bit. Bring it down here, now we're going to start getting a lot. But you can see it is still sometimes dipping below that line. So that's something quite interesting. Again, if we bring it down here, we're just going to get full-on whiteness. So let's put it somewhere where the effect is not too subtle, not too crazy. Let's try this, for example. And now let's open this and let's assign more things to audio modulation. And we could do them negatively if we want as well. This is pretty cool. And then, of course, we could also bring in LFOs and so on. So, I mean, just a vast world of possibilities here. Vast world of possibilities. Now, let's just finish off with two things. First thing, I'll do a little quick review, go over what I covered in this very briefly again, and mention things that I like and things that I think could be improved. And then after that, if I feel there's still time, maybe I'll go through a few more, just playing around with a few different controls in some different layer types. But let's see, this video is getting quite long already. Okay, so let's move on to final comments and review. Okay, so quick summary. What do I most like about this? Well, first of all, there's been a real need for quite a while now for an app like this that can be opened as an AUV3 and can create visuals that are actually triggered by MIDI. I mean, I love the way the MIDI triggering works in this. I love the fact that we can apply attack and release to the envelopes for that. I love the fact that it's got 4 LFOs, 4 audio modulators. I really love the way the audio modulation section, which is what we just looked at just now, has things like the spectrum mode. Those are things that I really, really enjoy playing around with. As I hope I showed you in this video, this is good, not just for beat-based music, club-based music, and so on. You can do really nice atmospheric visuals for ambient and stuff like that. So that's great. Very good interface. I actually really like the way that they've managed to make all of this a one-screen interface. I think it's been very elegantly done. So great job there. And I do think that it is really accessible to musicians, particularly people who have used Imaginando apps before. If you've used Frames, for example, which I reviewed not long ago, then things like the modulation matrix in this will be really easy for you. Now, two things I realized that I forgot to mention in the video. One thing, this is currently on a 50% off intro price. Not sure when that ends, but I'm sure you'll get the details probably in the App Store or on Imaginando's website or whatever. Another little thing that I wanted to mention, which I forgot to mention in the video, is that when we long press on a knob, for example, if I go down to this brightness knob down here, if I long press on it, it'll automatically open up the modulation matrix and it will highlight the brightness parameter. And here it's highlighted for LFO1, but we could easily go and assign any of these other things to it. That's another really nice little thing in the interface. So great interface, very user-friendly for musicians. What would be my main suggestions? Well, first of all, as I mentioned, the biggest difference at the moment on release between this and the desktop version is that this has no pop-out, i.e. you basically could not use the iOS version to VJ a second device or a projector or something like that at the moment. But Imaginando have told me that that is highly likely to come. They did not promise 100% that is coming, but they're going to do their best to make it happen. I think it is going to happen. I think that if that doesn't happen, a lot of people would be justifiably very disappointed. Another thing I really want to see happening is the ability to add our own images and video to material layers. So as I explained in the video, you cannot within the app itself modulate the background layer. That is due to certain technical limitations. Nuno did explain it to me, but it was just too much and too much to go into in this video. Anyway, end of the day, that's not going to happen. Background layer is not going to be modulatable within the app itself. So the workaround that Imaginando are looking at is opening up the other 8 materials layers to be able to accept your own visuals, your own photos, your own videos, and so on. So I do hope that that is something that gets added. Now, I already mentioned and showed you the workaround for the current way that we cannot modulate background within the app itself. I showed you using MIDI LFOs. So remember that that option is there and you can, in that way, modulate the background. Another thing I'd mention about the app is I had quite a tough time in my early days with this app, finding that things were not behaving as I expected. Just there's a lot of little pitfalls that kind of wait for you here and there when you go in and try and tweak presets. So a couple of just pointers for users. Now I've mentioned these scattered throughout the video, but a couple of things to pay attention to. If you're trying to tweak a patch and you're not getting interesting results, make sure that maybe you should be feeding MIDI into it. Secondly, make sure that the MIDI channel is set up right for whatever MIDI channel you're sending stuff in on. Also, pay a lot of attention to things like alpha and brightness. Now, this app is coming out with a couple of bugs. For example, I've had some weird issues like not being able to reset a layer after I copied another layer into that second layer. Things like this will be fixed. As I mentioned in the video, Imaginando are a highly responsible developer, responsible and responsive. So I'm not too worried about the couple of small bugs that are there now. I'm pretty sure that they are going to get fixed. What else? Okay, couple of things. I would love to be able to have this truly full screen. So we already saw that we can, click here and we can get full screen. But like AUM is one of the apps on iOS anyway, that you can actually open Windows the largest, but you still can't get a true full screen. Now, this is not Imaginando's fault, but what kind of surprised me is that there's no inter-app audio version of this. Now, I do understand that inter-app audio has been deprecated, but if there was an inter-app audio version, then at least you could run that truly full screen. The problem is there is a standalone app for this, but you can't actually pipe audio into it. For example, the standalone app can't load audio files. So, for example, there's no real way that you could use the standalone app to view full screen while doing audio modulation or syncing it with audio that you're putting in. Another little thing that I would like to mention that I think would be a good improvement is related to the material layers. So when we open up, let's say, for example, layer 5, I want to add a material. At the moment, the only way we can do that is by scrolling through this. Now, by the way, I didn't mention earlier, I think, but if you want to get out of this screen, if you look at the bottom right, there is an X, and you just press that X to get out. But again, if I want to go in and I want to choose a material, I've got to come in here. I've got to menu dive, basically. Whereas what I suggested to Imaginando, what to me would be really cool is if we could have something which is a little bit more similar to the presets. So in the preset menu, we have arrows where we can go forwards and backwards between presets, right? And we also have that cool thing that I got Imaginando to implement, the swiping to move between presets, swiping forwards and backwards. So what I would really love to see is a way here. For example, maybe I would just want to, in layer 5, very, very quickly preview one after the other a bunch of different materials without having to menu dive. Because, for example, at the moment, let's say I want to see what this one looks like. I have to go in here, I got to click, I come back out. Now that's been added. Let's say I don't like it, I've got to click again, double click. I got to go in and add this. Now, remember that you may not see these because of the way the blends are set up. So let's not worry about that too much at the moment. Maybe I'll just do it here, something. Right. So what would be really cool, I think, is if down here, this is where I would put it. So right beside this undo and redo button, I would like to have a forward and backwards button. And let's say, for example, I select layer 1, then I can use the forward and backward button here to just quickly scroll through all of the different materials and just stop when I find one that I like. That to me would be extremely useful. So that's just a few of my suggestions for improvements. If you're a regular on my channel, you'll know that there's no app that comes through, me doing a video on it that doesn't come out with some suggestions for improvement. And I'm sure that you as users will also have suggestions for improvements when you get this app. If you do, go to Imaginando's website, use their contact form or whatever to submit your suggestions to them. But overall, Great app, filling a much needed niche in iOS. A lot of fun to play with. Apart from a few little pitfalls here and there, pretty intuitive, pretty easy to get started with, especially if you understand already concepts like LFOs and envelopes, and if you understand how to use a modulation matrix. If you don't understand those things, it's pretty simple to grasp. And the manual is on Imaginando's website. It's, just 5 or 6 pages. It's like it would take you, maybe a couple of hours to just go through every point in the manual, testing it out in the app yourself. So, yeah, very enjoyable app. Really glad that Imaginando brought this out, and I'm really glad they sponsored this video. I've mentioned to viewers that, there have been so many apps that have come out recently for iOS. I really don't have time to review everything. And in future, I'm going to be being really pretty picky about what I review. There's a lot of apps that I'm not going to have time or motivation to review, particularly deep apps that take up a lot of my time. I'm just going to have less time for those. So I'd really like to encourage other developers, if you really do want me to make a video on one of your apps, considering making it a sponsored video. All right, guys, thanks again for watching. Good luck. And again, don't forget there's all the details of this wonderful giveaway if you're watching in the first 2 days there in the pinned comment at the top of the YouTube comment section. All right, I'll see you in the next video, folks. Take it easy.